Hey guys, Matthew here. In today's video, I want to talk about one of my starters for the upcoming 3.16 Scourge League, and that is going to be Eye of Winter Miner. Now, the TLDR of why you should consider playing a miner is that you get to bypass cast speed, and you can easily scale mine throwing speed, and essentially what that means is that you can get a lot of damage for very, very cheap. That's pretty much the reason to play a miner. The downside of playing a miner is that it's typically a little bit squishier than most other builds, and not only that, it also doesn't have that good clear speed because movement speed is a bit of a problem because you cannot do damage while you're moving. You got to kind of sit there and throw your mines. Now, I still think that because you get so much damage on a miner that you can actually make up for that lack of clear speed by simply killing things faster, so you actually end up having similar times in terms of map clearing. So the first thing I want to do for this video is I'll just go ahead and throw in a layer of the Hydra. So this is a Hydra boss with 48% more life. And this is affected by Guardian's Aid. So we're going to be getting double bosses. And apparently this is Awakener level 7. So this is just going to be a quick showcase of what the build looks like in terms of clear. One thing to note, however, which is very, very important, is that in the upcoming league, you are going to get access to significantly more defense than we do currently. So right now, this life pool does seem quite a bit low. And not only is the life pool really low, I basically have no real layers of defense outside of acro and phase acro. Now, you might be wondering why I have these, considering they're going away. I'll talk about that once we get over to the PoB version of the tree. But essentially, this is roughly the same amount of spell dodge that we used to have in the new tree we're still going to have. But the acrobatics and the dodge is what's getting buffed significantly, and you'll see that our EHP or defenses are quite a bit higher. So let's go ahead and just clear the map real quick. One thing to note about Eye of Winter is that it's a cold skill and it has really, really good clear. So that is going to be one of our main defensive layers, really. It's just going to be the fact that we can basically freeze everything, right? And by freezing everything, we are keeping ourselves quite safe. Now, I didn't really talk about gear or anything like that, but right now I have extremely budget gear on. I'm talking less than an Exalt or something worth of gear on, so it's very, very budget. And the good thing about it is that somehow they didn't really nerf this build at all. They pretty much left it completely untouched. And not only did they leave the build completely untouched, they actually kind of buffed it by increasing the survivability numbers by quite a bit. Especially with the changes to the Pantheons and things like cannot be frozen, which I currently don't have, which is going to be something that is actually quite important to mention. But yeah, again, once we get to the PoB portion of the video, we'll be able to talk about all those things. Just right now, I just wanted to quickly showcase kind of the damage and the clear, and of course, the single target as well. That's pretty much the main thing, right? When you're playing a miner, typically you're doing so because you want to be doing bossing. Now, one thing to note is that right now I'm using cold penetration on my links in order to do as much damage as possible. But if you were doing like lower tier mapping and stuff like that, or even just red maps in general, and not bossing, you would actually probably want to use faster projectile because the projectile speed would be quite a bit quicker, which would allow you to clear the map that much faster. So this is kind of what it looked like to clear a regular map. You know, it takes a couple minutes for a Guardian map. It's pretty much, you know, really good realistically for the level of investment and how early you could get this sort of gear, you know, tabula and all that. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Let's just showcase the single target. Now, there's a good chance that I died because of those defensive mechanics I was talking about. But one thing that I want to talk about real quick is the debuffing. So the debuffing in this build is very simple. We are going to be using Arcanist Brand to essentially put down pretty much all our debuffs, and then Bear Trap on top of that. And there's also going to be Hydrosphere, but currently I have Hydrosphere in my Arcanist Brand, but that's something that does change with the new PoB, as I'll showcase. So alright, let's go ahead and deal with this boss real quick. So again, 1 debuff, 2 debuff, we're going to put down our mines, and then we're pretty much just going to blow up the boss. So he is going to be going invisible. He's just going to be going away. Again, this is Maven, T16, extremely budget. And the damage is, you know, pretty respectable. I pretty much one-shot the boss here. Now, of course, I do have Guardian's Aid, which means I'm having to deal with 2 bosses, which obviously is going to make this a lot sketchier than it normally would be. And remember that my defenses are going to be a lot better in the upcoming league. So that's something that I can't help to to repeat, because right now I have pretty much no defenses whatsoever, right? I have very little, if any, in terms of defenses, but after the changes that are coming to the next league, the defense are going to be a lot more interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And it seems like both bosses are dead. No, there's one more maybe. No, I think both are dead. Well, that's pretty lucky. We actually got an item level 85 steel ring. Damn, I wish I got that on my league start. Well, rip my RNG. But anyways, that's kind of what the damage looks like. As you saw, you know, for the budget, it's actually pretty ridiculous. There's not many builds with this sort of budget that will annihilate bosses the same way with Guardian's Aid in 100% quantity map, Awakener level 7 with Maven. That's just not something that you get on most builds with this level of investment. Actually, most build, even with 10, 20, 50, 30x investment, won't even get that sort of damage. So Eye of Winter with Hydrosphere is pretty strong. Now that I've showcased, let's go ahead and talk about the actual build itself and the new PoB. So there's going to be a PoB in the description. The first thing you're going to see when you open the PoB is the endgame level tree, which is level 90. I typically make my league starters around level 90. I don't make league starters at 96 because most people are not going to get to 96. So one thing to note is that you will get basically all of the leveling trees. So you can see them right here, right? You get Brutus, you get Merveil, Val Oversoul, and so on, all the way up to level 75. And then finally the endgame level 90 PoB, which is going to be adding 2 medium clusters, which are very, very cheap. Now, a lot of the time people hear about cluster jewels and they freak out because they're like, oh my god, this is so expensive. No, fortunately for us, the clusters for miners, the bases themselves are extremely cheap. But not only that, they don't really require any item level. I believe it's either item level 1 or 50. And Expert Sabotage and Surprise Sabotage, matter of fact, pretty much every one of the nodes from the miner and trapper cluster jewels they have a really high weighting, so they're super easy to make. Matter of fact, when I made these my own cluster jewel for this build, it cost me around 100 alterations and a handful of regal orbs. So we're talking about a few chaos in a league start scenario because alterations are very cheap. Maybe 10, 20 chaos and you would have both your cluster jewels ready to go. That's a bit of a secret because realistically they sell for a lot more than that, but you should be self-crafting them. If anything, you might want to craft some and sell them to other people who are unaware of that fact. So that's the first thing you're going to see, again, is all of the leveling as well as all the masteries and all that good stuff. Next, you're going to head over to the gems. Now, there's not too much to talk about here. One thing to note is that, as I've already mentioned, you can clear with faster proj and then put in cold penetration for the bossing. But if you don't really care too much, like the map that I just showcased was with cold penetration for the entirety of the map. And, you know, personally, I think it's perfectly adequate, but you could go faster proj, especially for things like Scourge Mechanic, for example. It might be a good idea because you'll be able to freeze things off screen before it even has a chance to get to you. One thing that changed a little bit is the Arcanist brand setup. We're still using Sniper's Mark, but instead of using Hydrosphere and Frostbite, we're dropping that additional curse that we used to use, and instead we're using Frostbomb and Calling Strike. Now, why use Frostbomb when we're also getting the exposure from our Frostbite, from our Hydrosphere is very simple. Frostbomb also have the 75% reduced life regeneration rate, which is super, super awesome for bosses, right? Whenever Maven says, Vitality Boon, and the boss goes from 2% HP to 100%, that's really annoying, and that's going to help you a lot with that. And then Calling Strike is going to give you Calling Strike on the Frostbomb pulses, as well as the Arcanist brand, I believe, so that's pretty good. Alright, next we're going to go Flame Dash Arcane Surge, just easy way to get some damage and some mana regen. Arcane Surge is always really nice. As you can see, it's about, 13% more damage, so that's pretty juice. And then Cast on Death Portal. Now, I did talk about defenses, and I'll talk about defenses a little bit more later on. But even with the changes to defenses, you're a miner, you are going to be squishy, and there's nothing wrong with having Cast on Death Portal. That's probably one of the first things that I personally buy after doing Chaos Recipes for a few times, because it's going to be very, very helpful. If you do, make a mistake or lag or whatever it is and end up dying, you don't have to rerun the entire map, especially considering you have to remember that miners don't move around that quickly. Alright, next we're going to go ahead and use Steel Skin and Increased Duration for some defensive purposes. You'll see that right now in the game, in the showcase, I had about 3.6k HP. The new build has 4.3k on top of the big buffs to defensive mechanics. So the build is actually quite a bit tankier. But Steel Skin adds an extra 2,200 about 50% of the time. So that's pretty good. Bear Trap for some additional damage. 25% increased damage whenever you throw that on an enemy is quite good. Grace is definitely a new addition that you'll see on most miners and trappers in general. We are able to run it because we go down here and grab Charisma with Reservation Mastery and the Evasion Mastery for the Mana Reservation Efficacy. And that allows us to run Grace and Skitterbots without even throwing it on Lightning on the build, and we are still going to have plenty of mana. Now, it does look like our mana is a little bit scuffed with 21 mana, but that's because we have as many mines as we can put down. If you even remove a single one of these mines, you'll have 37 mana, which is plenty to Flame Dash, use your Arcanist Brand, use your Bear Trap, and all that good stuff. So this level of mana is perfectly fine. And this is going to be Righteous Fire. You'll only turn this on for some single target juice. You're ever killing a boss, you get in there, you throw Righteous Fire before you detonate your mines, and all of a sudden your damage goes up by 40%. It's really nice. All right, this is where one of the other changes that I was mentioning happened. Hydrosphere is now with Onslaught. So instead of Hydrosphere being on your Arcanist Brand by itself and being automatically put down, I personally rather put down my Hydrosphere because it allows me to put it down where I really want it to go down, and the placement of Hydrosphere is really important. When you put Hydrosphere down with Arcanist Brand, it is going to be directly on top of the boss, and that's not really what you want to do. You want the Hydrosphere to essentially act as a way to chain projectiles that would have normally not hit the boss into going over and hitting the boss with Snake Pit. I'll talk about that when I head over to the gear section. So what that means essentially is that you're going to want to put down Hydrosphere either right next to the boss. Probably, let's say Officer Karak was the boss. I probably want to put it around right here, or right here, or right here. If it's directly on top, it's really not doing much for me because the projectiles are already hitting the boss, and no projectile can hit the same target twice. Yes, you can shotgun a boss with multiple projectiles, but the same projectile can never hit the same enemy twice, and because of that, by having the chain happen directly on the boss, it's really not serving any purpose. And then finally, one thing that is not necessary but that you might want to do is use an Arrogance setup with a low level clarity. Now this is going to take your life pool from 4.3k to 4.1k, which is not that big of a deal. 200 life is not exactly going to keep you alive. And what that does is that it helps you with mana sustain, because one thing about this build, if I head into the game right now and I throw a bunch of mines and I detonate them, you'll see that my mana pool is going to go down to 0 really quickly. This build definitely eats up a lot of mana. Now, you are going to be using an Enduring Flask. I'll talk about that in a second. But even just the Enduring Flask alone is going to struggle when you're really spamming those mines. If you ever run out of Flask, say against a boss or something, or you accidentally hit your Flask 7 times, then you are going to want to have this set up. It's not necessary, but it's just something to think about. Now, in terms of the gear, it's super budget stuff. We're looking at +1 cold with a little bit of crit chance to spells on our wands. Craft on spell damage, call it a day. We're talking about wands that are just going to be a few chaos. Now, if we're talking about, trying to push these wands to the next level to really get some good wands, add in some crit multiplier could be good. Adding in, obviously, +2, so +1 and +1 to all spells. Adding in some flat damage to cold is also quite good for this build. Critical Strike multiplier is good, and of course mine throwing speed is also quite good. So there's a lot of things you can really do if you want to go for some endgame wands that are still going to be, nothing compared to some other builds that have, like, for example, bows that are extremely expensive. All right, Ursine Pelt could be any other helmet, but you do want it to have evasion on top, and that is going to be absolutely mandatory because of Spell Suppression Mastery. This gives you 10% chance to suppress spell damage if your boots, helmet, and gloves have evasion. So you're going to want to make sure that even if it's not a pure evasion base, that there is some evasion on your pieces of gear. So that's why I put in Ursine Pelt here, but otherwise it's just life and resistance, cheap stuff. Tabula Rasa is going to be your go-to for early league. However, you want to transition into a Skin of the Loyal, and this is pretty much your first big purchase after the Snake Pit. I say that, but Snake Pit is just the 30-40 chaos or something like that, and then the cluster jewels are extremely cheap, as I've already mentioned. So the first real big purchase, 1x plus sort of item, is going to be a Skin of the Loyal. Now, Skin of the Loyal is pretty good because it gives you +1 level of Sakata Gem, which is kind of nice. But not only that, it gives you 100% global defensive increase, which takes your evasion from 18,500,000 to 25.7 thousand, which is a huge buff to your survivability. Now, of course, it's not at all mandatory. A Tabula Rasa will do just fine all the way up to bosses. But when we're talking about, say, for example, Delirium maps in T16s, not that this build is made for that, but that Skin of Loyal is going to keep you alive by a lot due to evade being very, very interesting. It's also really nice for Aziri specifically because she throws spears at you, and these are something that you can evade, so the more evasion, the better for Uber Aziri. Otherwise, gloves, life and res, you could go for some temple gloves if you're able to pick some up for cheap. That would be 50% increased damage, which is not bad. Aziri Step is another one of those things which is kind of mandatory. Not really, but it does add a ton to the build. I mean, it's got good life, good move speed, a ton of evasion. Not only that, it also has chance to suppress spell damage going up to, I believe, 26% when perfect, which equates to about 12% spell dodge, which is kind of what you see right here because the unique items are not yet updated on PoB, or at least they weren't when I made the build. All right, next we have an amulet with Mark of the Prey, and that is going to be our go-to in terms of our anoint, which is extremely cheap as well. You know, a Sepia, Indigo, Crimson. We're talking about a couple chaos for a Crimson, or 2 or 3 chaos for a Crimson, 1 chaos maybe for an Indigo. You might even be able to get those for cheaper in a league start scenario because there's so many people farming, you know, low-tier blighted maps for chaos recipe. So very, very good anoint, not only because of marked enemies take 10% increased damage, but marked enemies grant 30% increased flash charges to you. That means that when you're killing these bosses, your flash charges are always going to be up pretty much, unless you're really just going ham on the pianoing. So yeah, really, really solid anoint there, but otherwise you're just looking at life and crit multi. If you can't get it, get some res, get some crit chance. It really is kind of up to you, but just life and a bit of crit multi should be very easy to get. All right, next, a ring. This one has a bit of strength, which is kind of required, actually. You'll need one of your items to have strength on it. It doesn't need to be a ring. It could be a pair of gloves. It could be your amulet. It could be anything else. Bit of life, bit of res. That's about it. All right, Snake Pit, as I already mentioned, is one of the mandatory items for single target. So this is not really going to help you really much at all when it comes to clearing the map. Sure, the chain is nice, but it doesn't do too much. However, this is where you're going to do the Snake Pit and Hydrosphere tech, and this is kind of when your chain becomes very, very, very valuable. And put it this way, you're not going to need this Snake Pit before you hit red maps, and by the time you hit red maps, by just doing Chaos Recipe alone, you should have been able to purchase this item alongside pretty much every other item anyways. So it should be pretty okay. All right, next we have a heavy belt. This is, again, for strength. We are going to need some strength elsewhere. We really do need a lot of strength, and there's none at all on the tree for us. So we have to get strength on our items, and that is for the steel skin that I was mentioning earlier. Pretty much the only real reason. Also for the arrogance if you want to go down that route. All right, a Seething Divine Life Flask is Staunching for Corrupted Blood, Enduring of Warding. Now, Enduring of Warding is actually being changed back. Instead of being Remove Curses on Use, it's going to be, the Tier 1 modifier is 66% reduced effective curses during Flask Effect. So if you pair that up with the Yugal Pantheon, which is now also getting buffed to 30% reduced effective curses, essentially you can get a Flask and a Pantheon, which put together are going to give you around 90-95% reduced effective curses during Flask Effect, which essentially means that you're immune to curses. Not quite, because, you know, you're still going to have that 5 or 10% curse effectiveness on you, but that is very, very negligible. So that's really nice for quality of life. Quicksilver for, obviously, mapping. You could change that up for a Sulfur if you want to try to just maximize damage, but Quicksilver is really nice. A Diamond Flask of the Order with an Enkindling Orb. This is essentially where a lot of your critical strike chance is going to come from, so I highly recommend you get that early. Diamond Flask, Enkindling Orbs, which are getting buffed to 70% effect. I just put a 60% on this flask. And then of the Order, which is a craft that you can put on the bench mod for 4 Glass Glower's Baubles, if I remember correctly. So very, very easy to do. Next, we have a Jade Flask of Reflexes. This is where a lot of our evasion comes from. You'll see that when your flask is not active, your survivability is going to go down, but your flask should pretty much always be active, especially during bossing while you're using Mark of the Prey. And because this build is basically hitting the entire screen, it's always killing a bunch of stuff. So as long as you're not pianoing your flask like crazy, you should have permanent uptimes on all of your flasks. I already talked about the clusters, so there's nothing to write home about here. In terms of the jewels, we're just going for life and one crit multi. Could be crit multi dispels, elemental skills, cold skills, global crit multi, and critical strike multiplier while dual wielding. So you have 5 different critical strike multipliers that you can use alongside a life. So these jewels should cost you no more than a couple chaos each. If you're paying more than that, you are scamming yourself. Now, of course, there are some that are better than others. For example, global goes up to like 10% crit or something. Meanwhile, for spells and for cold goes up to like 15 or 17, right? So there's some difference there, but realistically, it's not that big of a deal when you have over 500% crit multi. Welcome to the life of a miner. You get crit multi for free. And then finally, one thing that is a little bit different here is going to be this jewel. So you'll want a jewel with some flat fire damage to spells. Now, this used to be really important for builds that use Cinder Swallow, but the reason why we are using it is to enable Explosive Expert, which gives us an additional 40% critical strike multiplier. Now, the last thing I want to talk about real quick is exactly that, the Ascendancy. Again, all of the leveling, the Ascendancy points, the order, and all that is all going to be in the notes portion of the PoB. But one thing to talk about the Ascendancy is that you have 2 different options. You can go for Explosive Experts for damage. I mean, it is a good bit of damage. Look at that, 24% more damage. It's pretty good. It gives you a lot of crit. It gives you some good pen. It gives you some good multi. But if you want to go for something a little bit more defensive, you could actually go for Born of the Shadows. Now, yes, Blind got significantly nerfed, but you still get 15% reduced damage taken from blinded enemies, and this does stack with your Mind Mastery right here, which is enemies applies 2% reduced damage dealt to enemies near it, up to 10%. Essentially, what that means is that you get 25% reduced damage from enemies that are both blinded. Is it blinded? Yeah, that are blinded, and basically if you've detonated or if you have mines close to them, which should be at all times. So that's the more defensive options. Personally, Explosive Expert is my go-to because it just gives so much damage. But that's definitely something that you can go for. I guess the type of content that you're running, if you're mapping, this is definitely better. You're not going to need that damage whatsoever. And if you're talking about endgame, that's kind of when you go Explosive Expert. Now, in terms of damage, the damage may look like it's a little bit low on the PoB with the Tabula and the super cheap gear. We're rocking about 2.6 million DPS, and this was with a 4 overlap on Eye of Winter, which, by the way, you're getting a lot more than that, but that is just kind of a reasonable amount with the Hydrosphere, Snake Pit tech, because you're losing a lot less projectiles. But the actual damage that you're going to be getting out of this build is probably somewhere around 5 to 6 million, which is adequate for basically everything all the way up to Maven. Maven can get sketchy, especially with the ad phases, but like, for example, T16 maps, as you saw in the showcase, all that good stuff, it just plows through content like nothing else. Shaper, Elder, Uber Elder, those are all things that even with this exact setup you would be able to do. Now, the Skin of Loyals does push that damage up to about 3 mil, and some better wands. Obviously, this is also without quality on our gems, so you could easily get more damage by simply throwing on quality on your gems. You can go from 3 million pretty easily to, 3.6 million, so that's a lot of damage that you can get from simply just adding quality, which is very low cost. And of course, all of your gear can be upgraded for the most part. If you're able to get a Snake Pit that has Elder influence, you could even go with a Mark of the Shaper, but that's a story for another day. But that is pretty much my one of my league starters for the upcoming Scourge League. I don't know. I'm probably leaning towards this one the most out of all the ones that I have prepared. But I'm not sure yet. All of them look so good. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this guide. Before I go, as always, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters. Cat, Alex, Brandon, Nate, the second Alex, Flame Scorpion, Neroth, Grimoire, the Great Master, Johnny, Thomas Mass, Reese, Tim, Axel, Road to Millions, Atticus, Scott, Stan, Zarashi, welcome back, Wolverine, Ronald, Kevin, the third Alex, Bitizen, and Mercury, as well as, of course, anybody else who's supported me in the past and anybody else who is, anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.